It's very important to realize that markets take 20 years, okay? 0 to 2 is infancy. 2 to 5 is kind of adolescence. 5 to 10 is young adults, and 10 to 20 is maturity. It's very important to understand it's generational.
I'm very grateful and happy and excited to be able to speak to the Dr. Richard Sandor, father of financial futures at the Chicago Board of Trade in the 1970s. He is the originator of the interest rate futures that the entire financial services industry, the banking system, depends on for its cost of funds. And over the years, he's been involved in the commodities, in building the commodities futures market, and in days long forgotten, the climate change futures for clean air, and all of that is happening today with the Paris Accord and the COP26 initiative and so on. When I look at Richard Sandor's CV, or rather his life story, I get this impression that he is the father of markets in general. And every time he saw a problem, he thought that the best solution for that problem is the creation of a market because it's the best platform to realize the price, the cost of resolving a risk of any kind, whether it's commodities or the environment. So I'm very happy today to be able to speak to the man himself. There are a few people who I, actually wish that I had met before in my life. I'd say, Walter Wriston would have been one of them for the innovations that he did in the financials, in the banking industry, John Boyle in the fund management industry, and so on. And along with these legends is Richard Sandor. So Richard, I'm so happy to be able to have this chat with you. And I have a lot of, basic first principles to check with you in this conversation.
Thank you. It's an honor to be speaking to you again. And I'm excited, as you are, about the dialogue. And want to say thank you to anybody who might be listening and viewing for opening up your computer or your home to this dialogue.
And this is the legendary picture of you with the hat and and in a relaxed Chicagoan style. Were you born in Chicago, or are you native to Chicago?
No, I was born in New York, Brooklyn, New York, and grew up there, born and bred, and went to graduate school and got a PhD from the University of Minnesota. I had a wonderful economics teacher. And he said to me, you really should study economics because it is the queen of the social sciences. So I went to graduate school in Minnesota. I left there and then got the privilege of teaching a landing at Berkeley, California in 1966. And I taught there for 6 years. So it was the birth of everything different, of civil rights, of every sort, gender, diversity, gay, straight, whatever came out of the Berkeley campus. But out of that same campus, Emmanuel, came an open-mindedness towards finance. It was the birth of modern finance theory. It was 66. It was Harry Markowitz. It was Myron Scholes for the Black-Scholes. It was a vibrant, the Berkeley-Stanford finance attitude, and you had to realize that the world was changing. And that became a petri dish to grow all kinds of new objects and bacteria, not only transistors in Silicon Valley, but a lot of modern finance came out of California in those days.
That's interesting that you put it that way, because you're saying California is the tail that wagged the dog, because a lot of what the U.S. Financial system today is from that so-called Berkeley mafia.
Yes, it was, and it was the nature of the times. You couldn't walk out on campus and watch 20 different student advocacy groups, whether, as I said, it was for gender equality or racial equality or every sort of student rights and things of like, remember, that was called the free speech movement, which began in 1964. As a student of history, you will know the whole idea of curriculums being open, that students had rights to learn, that open dialogues, especially confrontational between faculty and students, were encouraged. So it was not only the birth of Silicon Valley, but the birth of ideas about social change at the time.
From everything that you're saying, that's a conversation in itself. Because when we think about everything that the US and the world is going through today because of the pandemic, how far can we take, the idea of liberalism maybe, but the idea to be able to think freely and to create freely. And whether we've now arrived at a point where some form of control is possible. That's a conversation in itself, okay?
It is absolutely in itself. I have said to people who have questioned me about climate and things like that, and in the book that I wrote, I said, if you want to look at the future, look to California and China. Okay, that the best leading indicators are what's happening in those geographies. My mentor and friend Ronald Coase wrote a book when he was 101 years old, and it's called How China Became Capitalist. And the fundamental hypothesis was they started with a blank piece of paper in the late 70s when the first class of Peking University came back after the Cultural Revolution. There was no model, so they had to make it up, and they had no legacy problems. And California was the same thing in the United States. It was 3 hours from Washington. Nothing much mattered. It was a gold rush state. Institutions were built from scratch, and there were no legacies that distracted them and forced them to do things the same way that others do.
And well, in some ways, they made it up as they went. And in some ways they constantly checked. The difference between China and California would be that China kept checking with so-called best practice leaders around the world, and they were actually agnostic as to whether they were learning from the US or from Europe or from some other parts of the world. What made the best sense for them, and they constructed something that is unique to themselves, but they borrowed and they benchmarked. They compared themselves to the structures that were put in place. And that's where I come to talking about you, which is when China thinks about markets, and especially today in emissions trading, they think about you, Doc. And you set the tone, the standard, and you helped them with some of the infrastructure, didn't you?
Yes, I did, and I am very proud of the fact that I was able to confer with the head of the central bank, the head of the a 5-year planning commission, the NRDC, the various mayors of cities. And I found what you said, an incredible open mind. And because when we first made our speech, we were invited by the UN, and it was 2005 or 6, about 16 years ago. And I said, I have a novel idea that, as you get wealthier, you, like all nations, will have to address environmental issues. It is Kuznets' curve, a famous economist, that if you figure out a correlation between wealth and environmental activism, it's directly related. So the wealthier you get, the more you turn to your environment. In some sense, China was totally open to the idea that, yes, that they would at some point have to deal with an environment with, as you and I have spoken of, Beijing with no Sundays or 20 Sundays a year, that there was a change going on. And after wealth had been achieved and hundreds of millions had been taken out of poverty, as public policy makers, they were going to face a challenge. Nobody said that's stupid. Nobody said and in other countries, people have said it's, you're really a little crazy here, and even when I gave a talk in the UN at the Rio Summit in '92 for a market in carbon, it was pretty bizarre, but I did not have that problem in China. The answer was, really? And how would you do that? And we ended up partnering with CNPC. We were an American firm and the biggest company in China.
Oil company. Yeah.
Yes. PetroChina became our partners. And this is back in 2007. 15 years ago, we were partnering with the biggest oil company and one of the biggest polluters in China to fashion a public policy that would work for the Chinese people. And, that was pretty out there.
When I look at your career, you created the interest rate futures market, you created the climate bond futures market, or the market itself. You were instrumental in the creation of the commodities risk paradigm that the CBOT uses today. This is, I'm just throwing it at you, that whenever you saw a problem, you saw markets as being the way to solve them. Is that a fair generalized statement?
Yeah, and let me kind of put it in a general theory. So I'll give you my experience and then my views as a student of economics. We will put it in 2 buckets. So let me give you my bucket 1. If you take a look at the history of financial innovation, and I'll give you 4 examples. The invention of the limited liability corporation in 1605 and the financing of the Dutch East India Company. Let's talk about maybe the birth of rice trading in Osaka in 1697.
Yep.
Let's talk about the birth of agricultural futures, wheat, in 1848 in Chicago. Then let's take a look at the birth of the mortgage-backed certificate in 1970 in the US. And then let's take a look at the birth of climate and environmental goods and services. They all follow the same pattern, okay? The pattern is simply, boom, there's a big structural change, and there's a need for capital. So in the case of the Dutch East India Company, the Europeans had to finance the development of the spice trade, and they needed to raise capital, and there wasn't a financial way to do it. There were only partnerships, and shares were invented, and that allowed capital to be raised. After the structural change occurs, you have to grade it. So the share certificate became a homogeneous instrument. So you need legal evidence of ownership for a market to work, unambiguous property rights. After that, trading comes out informally, then exchanges, then derivatives, then complex financial contracts. I could go on, but there is a pattern that goes. And what's most important, I think, for people listening is to realize is financial innovation may have been the reason for European hegemony for 500 years. The invention of double entry bookkeeping and the limited liability corporation were incredibly important, as much as gunpowder or any industrial invention. And there's no authorship generally. When I see an inefficiency that could be solved, I consider all of the policies that could be done. And one of them, markets, serve to provide Japan with food, America with wheat, the Dutch with an exchange, the British with cotton. That if we take a look at the people who developed the standards for a product, they own the world. And that's a very important thing to consider.
There are actually three inflection points that I want to test with you from just what you have said, right? The person that you keep referring to as being your mentor, obviously, is Ronald Coase. I'm in the process of completing my first book, and I actually mentioned Ronald Coase in the same sentence as Adam Smith, because Adam Smith, funnily enough, was not a friend or not a fan of institutions of big business. He thought that the small business owner was the best arbitrator of price discovery. But then civilization evolved over since Adam Smith's time to today, creating big business as the repository of profit, of information, of organization, to get things done. And actually, I came across Ronald Coase's name because he sort of gave a reason why big business eventually became the repository of commerce. And his basic point was that that information wasn't readily available to the small business. So the big business was the best form in its own day. The institution was the best form to garner information on what to pay workers, what the price discovery of goods are, and so on. And yet he promoted the idea of markets, to liberalize that price discovery mechanism, and you are his number one student in that regard, and you've made a reality in terms of everything that we see in markets today. And honestly, this conversation, it can go in 10 different directions, but I just want to pin it down to the one thing that matters today. Emissions trading, right? When you look at the prices that are being traded today, and I'm just going straight to the point on this one, in Europe, in Switzerland, in the markets where there is a lot of regulation, the price, for carbon trading, seem to be more workable. In other words, the price for which the parties are willing to pay for carbon is the kind of right price for it to be able to be used to go out there and rectify all of the problems created by a carbon emission. And then the markets that are actually very free, the price is trading at between $7 and $10 which seemed to be not so enough. So it seemed that you need a little bit of regulation, a little bit of policy, help to make markets work. So I'm going to throw that at you, and maybe you could give me a sense of, do you think that we are arriving at a point where markets need to be, constructed? It needs to be coiffed.
Yeah, I am of the belief that basically the markets that are environmental markets that are transparent, properly regulated, and set caps correctly are the best and most efficient ways to achieve reduction. And it is like Adam Smith or David Ricardo that the best way to achieve is specialization, where the people who are most capable of reducing emissions are incentivized to do it. In fact, it's a palindrome because it's a mapping. Because if I am the polluter and I'm no good at cutting emissions, but you are, I have to buy your reductions and I'm forced to pay for my pollution. You, on the other hand, have a profit incentive to produce those reductions. So the market, by a price, rewards the people who are doing the stewardship and the reductions and punishes it, not by a fee, but the market sorts out the incentives properly. Now, what's very important to recognize, and it's very important to recognize this in China and for your audience, the European carbon market is now 16 years old, okay? It began in 2005. There was a pilot phase. There was a goal from 8 to 12 to achieve Kyoto protocols. The caps weren't sufficient. The caps were tightened, and we finally got, with no disastrous impacts on the economy. They've been getting better and better in reducing emissions, but it's taken 16 years. So I think it's very important to realize that markets take 20 years, okay? 0 to 2 is infancy. 2 to 5 is kind of adolescence. 5 to 10 is young adults, and 10 to 20 is maturity. It's very important to understand it's generational. You don't start with a 777 or an Airbus as your first invention. You have a basic invention and then improvement inventions. The hypothesis is it's going to take 20 years, no different that it took 20 years to get to the internet. It took another 12 years to get to the smartphone. It took another 10 years to get to the cloud. It's not instant gratification. Ronald Coase said to me, you have to tell your story because most of the economics profession thinks markets are like spontaneous combustion, that you rub two sticks together. And what you have to do is you have to be sure that the timing is right. Okay, that's important. You have to make sure there's perfect competition. You have to make sure there's institutions for price discovery. You have to make sure there's an adequate cash market. You have to educate the regulators. You have to educate the lawyers. You have to educate the accountants. You have to educate back office and structural people. After you do all of that, you have to then educate the traders, the liquidity capital that's provided, the speculators, the market makers. It is a complex web of economics, sociology, psychology, regulation, and in lots of cases, legislation. So financial futures required an act of Congress, a new regulatory agency, a redefinition of what a futures was, and it took 20 years to mature too. They don't happen overnight.
I resonate with what you're saying. I mean, and thank you for taking time to build that message, because you're actually speaking like a businessman who's built something from scratch. Even on the platform, the markets, you got to make it happen. It's not we will build it and they will come. It's you got to get your first client, you got to get your second client and your third client, and then and show that it's working, and then you get the whole market mechanism moving.
The World Bank retained me to take a look at why financial futures failed the first time that it was tried. And I did a report. I did an autopsy on the body. And I said, look, you started to look to trade a bond futures when you didn't have an organized price discovery in the spot market. You didn't have a repo market. There was no lending, so people couldn't go short against the cheap futures. You had no institutional knowledge. 20 years later, involved with the Chinese Financial Futures Exchange and work with them on the design of the bond futures that now trades in China, and say this, and I say, believe it to my heart. Markets have to be designed specifically to fit the culture of the country in which you are in. So what is good for the US is not necessarily good for China. Alternatively, at the risk of being politically incorrect, a big challenge in China is to control speculation. And there's a very big difference between gambling and speculation. And there is speculators provide an important social role. Venture capitalist allows an investor to separate the financial risk from the scientific risk, right? And doesn't have to worry about the capital. You take other people's money. And that's what it does. In financial futures, a farmer who doesn't want the price risk of the crop that he's planting, he gives it to a speculator. In all cases, with speculation, you are transferring a risk that exists. That is different from gambling, where you're creating the risk for recreational value, right? So we have to be very careful to encourage speculation, but not gambling. Gambling doesn't have anything other than a recreational value, but the idea, and it was important in China when we said, look, you have to be very careful because it's a culture that cherishes and has sayings, as you well know, about chance and luck. And these are key elements to the Chinese culture. And given that predilection, you have to carefully regulate these markets.
The big difference between China and the US is that here, things like markets can be driven by policy. You are the father of the Chicago Climate Exchange. You're the founder. And you're basically the founder of a nationwide exchange for climate change, or for emissions trading. Amazing achievement. What's unique? What did it take to build a nationwide exchange in the US? As you know, in China, it's or many other countries, is very policy driven. Whereas in the US, you have to go out and talk to different people and persuade them and so on. So to bring it together. So what did it take to bring it together?
Whoa! It took incredible amounts of personal time with the right people, okay? That is decision makers, policy makers, and in different organizations, the identification of a decision maker at Ford or IBM or Intel or American Electric Power or Southern California Edison or Wisconsin Power. In some instances, they joined and agreed to cut emissions voluntarily. In Ford's case, because the younger Ford wanted to make an imprimatur on Ford being a green company like his predecessors had invented mass manufacturing. So the idea of making a transformational change was good. Second of all, it was practical because if they learned how to control emissions in their Fremont, California plant or their Detroit plant or Flint plant, they could use that technology in Marseille for their assembly theirs, and that was going to be regulated. So they saw it coming. DuPont saw a profit opportunity. They could change the refrigerants, which are highly, sensitive, they're high impact. Intel saw they could change how they scratch chips and make money from it and reduce emissions. Some people did it for the PR because they were in a consumer products business. So this requires building, and it is a network, okay, of like-minded people. And it is a very difficult and long task because at every point, you have to recruit as many people who can effectively reduce emissions and partner them with people who need to buy the services of emissions reductions. So every time there was supply, you had to create demand. Every time there was demand, you had to create supply. So it was a constant pulling of one player here, a counterrun there, an industrial user of coal with a producer of wind energy. It was a question of taking a complex network and making sure that at the different ends of the pipes met.
What's amazing about you is that, Doc, is that you're not just a man who created markets in the 70s and 80s and then into the 90s. I just love the fact that you just published a book in 2018, Electronic Trading and Blockchain. So I have this theory, and it comes from someone I read from the RAND Corporation, someone called David Ronfeld, who says that society moves from its tribal origins to its institutionalized forms and then into markets, and then it's moving into the future into networks. As the man who created markets on so many different levels, markets for financial institutions, markets for commodities, markets for carbon trading and the environment, and you're also involved in the initiative to build a US replacement for the LIBOR market as well. Do you see this transition? Markets in an institutionalized framework is every country, every place has its own market and their institutions and their own, and they represent their territory, as it were. But in the network world, we can be global, we can trade with each other, we are all nodes, connected to each other and so on. Do you see that transition, and how would you describe it in what you see taking place and how markets are changing because of networks?
The biggest and simple answer to is the commodity of this century is information. Okay, if we look at wealth creation since the end of World War II, from about 45 to 70, it was manufacturing. That was the biggest company in the world was General Motors. Okay, and the saying was, how goes General Motors, that's how America goes. In the 70s, okay, the value proposition was in energy and food. The first and second Arab oil embargoes in 73 and 79 failures of crops in China, failures of crops in Russia, anchovies not running off the coast of Peru, record food prices, all of that. By the 80s, the value proposition was in asset liability management, the consolidation of world capital markets. In the 90s, it was 86, Microsoft went public, so it was an age of computational skills. That's been followed by information and the social media as the value. So now it's an information age, the manufacturing value added, the food value added, the reorganization value added. The commodity of this 100 years is information and the underlying technology which allows it to be transferred.
Data itself is the commodity that's being traded on your exchanges. So you could see a market for data.
Data is artificial intelligence data. This is not the oil it pales by comparison to the value. Look at the market capitalizations of companies and see where the oil companies are relative to the informational. It's right before our eyes. We are creating and living in a world where the allocation and the production and distribution of data and information is the commodity of this century, in my humble opinion.
I mean, data has always been the commodity in a market, right? In the futures market that you created, you're actually creating based on expectation, right? But having created a market for interest rates, for commodities, for carbon, what do you see the market for data looking like? What would be its essential characteristic?
It's the business that I'm in now, the exchange that I'm in now. If you'll forgive me for talking about my current passion and love. In 2011, somebody called me up and said the Royal Bank of Scotland just fired 4 people for manipulating LIBOR. I said, no surprise, we had sold our climate exchange. We were looking at water markets in China and California. I called my staff in and I said, this is the end. That LIBOR is going because when a bank fires its own employees, you know that it's not one. There had to be, and as an economist, it's very simple. You can't collude unless you have 2. And if you have 2, you're going to likely have 4, and that the whole system was broken. There was no national interest rate in 07, 08, that there were people, surprisingly enough, a commodity which had no transport costs differed. The interest rate in California was different from Birmingham, Alabama, and different from Lexington, Kentucky, and different. How could it be that the world's largest economy, that the price of money, a non-physical commodity, could be 30% higher in one locale than another? It meant the system was broken. And that if I could connect a bank in Appalachia to lend money to a Brooklyn, New York bank to finance an Uber, I would unlock a huge amount of capital flows in the United States. That there was cash-rich areas in one part, that the US was a series of regional economies. Then, well, why is that of interest? It's of interest because if you took the average price of all that, that's really the American interest rate. It's not what gets traded between big banks. It's the flows of capital between 5,300, spread over 4 million square miles, 4 million square miles compared to 90,000 in the UK, 5,000 banks that represent $11 trillion in assets. And so I got on a plane I went to Green Bay, Wisconsin, and when it was 0 in the winter, I went to Tupelo, Mississippi, where Elvis Presley was born in the heat of summer. I went to the east and west and north and south. I visited 125 small banks and developed a network. Once the network was developed, I could be the honest platform for interbank borrowing and lending, and nobody need to set price because 100 different banks expressing their viewpoint, none of which were big enough to influence price, would create a Maribor, a national interest rate. That was the dream. That was 2012. I did that for 4 years. I got on a plane to Washington. Another advice for potential financial innovators: I have 3 rules. Never surprise a regulator, never surprise a regulator, never surprise a regulator. I got on a plane with the leading attorney, Raj Cohn at Sullivan and Cromwell. I briefed the Fed, I briefed the OCC, the FDIC, the SEC, the CFTC. I said, I have a dream. This is what I'm going to do, and I'm going to come back every year. I don't want anything from you, and I have nothing to criticize about your behavior. But I'm going to go in the private sector and try to develop a benchmark because LIBOR is dangerous and going to fall apart. And I came back every year and briefed them about what we were doing. The end of LIBOR is in 4 months, and we'll see if I got it right or got it wrong. And it'll be interesting no matter what happens, because it is really an incredible film or movie when you think about what can go wrong and what can go right. And can you link 5,000 financial institutions into a network? And if it succeeds, it's interesting why. And if we fail, it's interesting as well. It's a clinical study. So I'm excited. I think we have done the right thing. We are promoting the interests of small towns who disproportionately create jobs in America. The local bank is important when you've got a country of 4 million square miles. They need financial literacy, and their banker provides it.
Is banking the only institutional form for pricing the cost of money today?
We started with 3 or 4 small banks. We now have 5.2 trillion in assets, and the American Financial Exchange is 25% of US banking by volume and by numbers, 1,100, 1,200 banks. We have 44 non-banks, and because now there's so much liquidity outside of the bank. So we have corporates like John Deere and American Electric Power. We have insurance companies like Northwestern Mutual. We have money managers like Guggenheim. And so we have financial institutions and industrial companies and insurance companies because there are flows of funds that are so large, and the balance sheets of companies are so fantastic that there is a better way for supply and demand to meet.
And what would we see at the end of it? Is it an institution, another exchange?
You will see we have something called the American Financial Exchange, and we'll either take it public, which we did the Climate Exchange, and then it was bought by the Intercontinental Exchange. Our investors did handsomely. They made 7.5 to 15 times their money. And the dream is that we take this public and the Chicago Merc or the New York Stock Exchange buys it, or maybe the Hong Kong Exchange, and we create a new American Financial. And then I can come back and talk about water with you, because I have a dream about water and information and data that I want to get on with too.
You're an intellectual. You're a markets creator. You're a businessman. All in one. This conversation really can go in many different directions. Just one last question, just for this conversation. When you see the equities market going, the way it's doing now. In fact, last night both Nasdaq and Wall Street, did very, very well. It looks like there is no end to that. What do you think of when you see equities going so well? Is it at the expense of everything else? Or do you think there should be some kind of a reckoning and a balancing in the U.S. economy?
Yeah, I think there is at some time, but the difference is today we've created, $4 or $5 trillion in the US of new money. And if you look at the alternatives, the 10-year at 112, gold at 1,800 an ounce, fixed income 30 years, at 2.3, mortgages, Ginnie Mae's at 3.0. Equities on a relative basis are cheap. Now, having said that, I think somebody's got to be really cautious here that these are hitting unmatched highs.
Unmapped territory.
Unmapped territory. There's liquid oxygen seeping out, and then I could either propel a rocket or the rocket falls over. So it's not like we're ready for escape velocity, into a new orbit. So I think people have to be careful and measure the risks. It's not to say it's not going to continue to go up, but I think prudence is widely misused, and that people should think about it. It's not as easy as it looks. And remember, two things as a trader, and a last wisdom: it never looks worse than at the bottom of the market, and it never looks better at the top of a market.
We all worry about, how the U.S. economy is evolving. It's in uncharted territory. The so-called quantitative easing, the Fed, putting out so much money out into the marketplace, never done before. And just when you thought that 2008 was already the height of, printed money, it's now going on to another realm altogether.
I worry about that. I really do, because it is uncharted, and these are very smart people. But this is a $22 trillion economy. And if you get it wrong, it's not like a rowboat, where you take one oar out of the water and you change direction. It's 22 trillion, and it's got to be carefully handled. So far, I think the grades are very good. I applaud the chairman of the Fed and the last 3 or 4. They've been great. They've done a great job. But I'm always worried about the things I don't see and I don't know, and I don't know what's going on structurally. You can't have unending growth. The business cycle is not over, in my opinion. We're going to have to be prudent as we watch this. Having said that, I have worries about what economists call rent seeking, the purchase of economic power through political power. I think it's very dangerous in the United States that there's one end that's prudent regulation, and there's another where the regulation is purchased. And I think the economists call that economic rent, and I worry about purchased regulation as opposed to prudential regulation. But by and large, it has been, since I grew up, forever, a very bad idea to short America's ingenuity. it's not a good trade.
The big thing about the US economy is that it's the most externalized economy in the world. The rest of us hold US debt, and the rest of us, and the single biggest US debt is the dollar, right? I'm told that nearly 40% of US assets circulate outside the US. It might be higher for the dollar itself. So the rest of us are invested.
Including me too. So we're all invested. I share with you. You and I are brothers that way.
In that way, so it's in our interest to make sure that, that it takes us somewhere. Like someone once said, if you owe the bank $10,000, you're in trouble. But if you owe the bank, $100 million, the bank's in trouble. So, so I mean, it is an economy that's now 27 trillion in debt. And as you say, the GDP is about 22 trillion. It's the ability to meet its obligation is stretched at this point. So, it'll be very. And having said that, so much of GDP today is created on digital and the future. We are back to 1901, which is the productivity gains and so on, justifies it along as we go along. So, in a lot of ways, all of us continue to be guided by the innovations that are taking place in the US. Your career as an outsider looking in is predicated by the US leaving the gold standard in 1971, and then the price of money floated and had to discover its a new mechanism, and you created the markets for that, the interest rates futures, and we're back in there. Last point, I mean, in that book on blockchain, what are you saying? I just want to capture, your sense on blockchain, on crypto, on, as I said, the network aspect of the economy.
The message was simple and consistent with the conversation the two of us have just had and the warm exchange of ideas. So, I did work at Berkeley in the 60s and developed the first schematics for electronic trading as a young professor. And it went dormant for years. And then all of a sudden, patents on it came about. And I used that as a vehicle to say electronic trading, the first application of it. There was the work we did in Berkeley in '69 to develop it was a wild model. It was the world would someday have electronic markets that were for profit, as opposed to physical markets that were mutually owned. So this was a whole new bust model. It was to create a new exchange in San Francisco, because there were none in the West Coast, and there were commodities indigenous like palm oil and other commodities to which there would be a natural home. I did some consulting in '86 with Arthur Andersen Consulting, and the first people were to enjoy and embrace it were the Swiss. The next were the Germans in 1990. They upended the English floor model, and for the first time, Germany became a market-based country. And it became pervasive in the United States in 2000. So the birth of electronic trading and its ultimate distribution was a 20 to 40-year history. The blockchain was not invented by Nakamoto in '07 or '08. There's a guy by the name of Stuart Haber who developed the blockchain, who was an academic at Princeton. And he did the first work on the blockchain in 1990. If that time period is right, the world will change 20 to 40 years later, which means by 25 to 30, crypto, blockchain, et cetera, if we use electronic trading or other financial innovations, the message is the blockchain is already here. It's not as new as people think. Power steering was invented in the 30s and didn't get used until the 50s. The blockchain has been invented a long time ago, and cryptos came along, but the innovation is far enough along, and you're going to wake up one day and it's all digital, and it's happening quicker. I didn't know it, but COVID-19 accelerated the entire trend that existed before.
Does blockchain change anything that you have created in markets? The way in which information is packaged, that's shared between different people and in a trusted form, does that change?
Yes. So we are, I think, the only exchange in the world that is on the blockchain, this little thing, American Financial Exchange. And every time a trade occurs, we print a private coin, Ethereum. That says every exchange will publish the price of a good or a stock, the quantity that changed hands, right? And the time. We record where the money originated in Lexington, Kentucky, where it was consumed in Chicago, Illinois. We tell you the borrower's characteristic, what their tier one capital was, what their loss ratio was, what their net interest margin. So every time you create a trade, we can actually instantaneously track the cash flows across the 50 states and the 4 million square miles. We can tell you the city and state that the money came from and where it went. That's a market in itself, those coins.
So you're well into the future. So, you're not done yet.
Don't be fooled by the fact that I'm 700 years young.
Doug, this is a great conversation. Even on that point alone, blockchain, that's another 2 hours worth of drilling down to how it's going to come together for you and for markets in a whole.
Well, listen, I have to say, coming from you, it means a lot because you were a creator yourself. And while I'm the focus of this interview, you have an equally rich story. You built an organization that's world renowned. You've been a leader, the very fact that, you could create a market for 30,000 people to listen to a conversation, forget who is on it, is an incredible achievement in of itself. So I'm honored to be the subject of your inquiry.
Thanks, Doc. Thank you very much. But the honor belongs to me. You're the man who's created so much of what the market infrastructure is in a country which is ruthless. You have to make it happen. It's not driven by policy. You have described it. You have to go knocking door by door. And I think that you've coupled charm and entrepreneurship and intellectual rigor into amazing story. I don't say this, lightly. When I say it's my honor to have had this conversation with you, I really mean it. And I wish I'll be able to test with you, different topics along as we go along. So thank you very much for spending time with me today.
It's a pleasure. I really look forward to that dinner in Chicago or in Beijing. As you know, I'm a big fan of China, as you are, and thank you for having me again.
Thanks, Doc. Thank you very much.